Hey again. So this is where I'm at in the wake of all of that work with the hand planing, and then also using my planer. And this is the material I'm going to be using for my bench. So I have three pretty epic pieces, and then I've got a fourth little guy in here. So at this point, all of this needs to get joined together. I'm gonna be doing a big glue up. So before I do the glue up, we can see that when I pull everything together right now, there's gonna be a certain amount of gapping. What I need to do is I need to address the sides of each of these boards where they're going to be glued to one another, and make it so that they're going to be able to fit nicely. I have a handy dandy whiteboard to better illustrate what I'm talking about. So if I clamp these guys together next to one another, and I really exaggerated it in this drawing so that you would understand what I was talking about, but these are my little clamps. When I use my hand plane to clean this side, if there's any cant from one side to the other, doing them like this so that then they fold out means that they're still going to create a nice flat piece when they're glued up together. So that's what's next. So here we go. I plane from the center of the board, starting with short strokes in the middle and then slowly extending the stroke to the length of the board. This makes it slightly concave, which means that as the pressure of the clamps comes on during the glue up, there's less chance of gapping at the ends. Then once the glue surfaces are prepped, I coat both sides and stick them together. I use wood glue for these types of glue ups, which means I only have 3 to 5 minutes of open time. This is one of the reasons why I glue each section independently, and it also means that if a guest arrives during a glue up, you have to keep rolling. Best practice after a glue up like this would be to wait about 5 to 10 minutes for the squeeze out to become tacky. It would be more or less time depending upon how warm or cold the environment is. And then just scrape it with a putty knife. If you do it like this, it comes off really easily, and any leftover residue cleans up with a damp cloth. Obviously, I didn't do that in this case, probably because I had somewhere that I needed to be right after the glue up. But that does mean extra time spent chipping away at dried glue. It also means, in this case, that I'm using my chisel for glue cleanup, which is probably not recommended use for a nice tool. So do as I say, not as I do. Clean up while the glue is still tacky, and don't use your chisels for glue cleanup. And so then it's a case of lather, rinse, and repeat with your glue ups. In this case, you'll notice that once the clamps start going on, I use some that are in the direction that you would expect, and then I'm also putting some clamps on vertically. These are right on the joint where the two pieces meet, and the vertical clamps actually help to keep them aligned. Once the glue goes onto these surfaces, they slide around very easily, and so it can make it difficult to keep them from getting out of plane with one another. So the vertical clamps help to hold things in place while you're getting your laterals on. A quick note on the fact that I put away the clamps every time. It seems from one perspective a little bit obsessive compulsive to do that, but when you've got clamps all over the place, you end up with chaos. So it's a lot easier to keep yourself organized by just putting things away. And trust me, I'm the last person to follow that advice most of the time, and even I have learned that a certain amount of cleanliness is next to godliness. So the caul that you see me putting on here, again, these are pieces of wood that have a little bit of a convex to them. I've used a hand plane just to shape each of those boards a little bit. And what that does is it allows me, as this glue up is getting wider and wider, it allows me to put more pressure on the center of the board by clamping on either side of that caul. So by this point in the glue up, my pieces are starting to get fairly large. This would make it really difficult for me to use quite the same technique that I had described earlier of joining the boards clamped to one another at the same time. So instead, I'm working on getting them as square as possible to create a nice joint between the two. I use the pencil marks to show me where I have made good contact with my hand plane, and then I'm checking with a stare-it square to make sure that I've got a nice square angle between what's going to be the top of the bench and where the edge of the joint is. And this is the last section getting glued together. So this is going to be the last gluing and clamping for this bench top. I feel like you get an entertaining impression of the weather in a Nova Scotian spring by watching this series of video clips, because I'm going from being in my kind of standard overalls to my winter overalls, which are, you know, thermal insulated, very heavy and bulletproof guys, and then all the way down to shorts at some point. So, oh, and there they are. And we get to pack down the clamps for the last time in this glue up. Very exciting. And suddenly it's summer and we're dying of the heat. So now, in spite of the fact that I've done the best that I can to keep everything flush with one another during the glue ups, it all needs to be planed together in one piece. And obviously I don't have a planer wide enough to accommodate such a large surface area. So doing it all by hand, I'm starting out on a diagonal just to cover as much territory as I can. And then eventually I'll do it with long strokes, the length of the bench, for to get my finish. Okay, so I'm partway in, and what you can see here is that the pencil marks that I draw from the farthest edge to the closest edge of the bench top allow me to see where my blade is registering and where it's not. So it is beginning to flatten out, but you can see everywhere that there's pencil marks that these areas are lower than either edge. So I'm half an hour into this and I'm starting to feel it. It's definitely good exercise. So here comes the next bit. So I won't have you sit through 5 minutes of me at high velocity flattening this bench, but needless to say, it took a fair bit of time and elbow grease. But, you know, I did eventually get there. It's just keep going and keep checking in, put your marks, keep the paraffin on your plane, and eventually So that's it for getting the bench top ready. It took some elbow grease, but we got there. So the next videos are going to be of the installation of both the face vise and the tail vise. A huge shout out to my patrons through Patreon. If you want to check out my Patreon page, we'd love to have you. There's all kinds of cool benefits coming down the pipeline, included a draw that's coming up for swag with my very cool new logo done by local artist Anna Bulb. So thanks for joining me, and I hope you guys keep coming back for more. See you next time.